Thank you for your patience. I've been asked to ask you to turn off your beepers, iPods, anything else. And we will go back in time to 1985. How many of you actually saw either of these movies in theaters? Okay, good. A crowd of old-timers. I like that. This is a video arcade. This is where I went to play games with a roll of quarters with my friends. I didn't yet have a video game console of my own, so that was pretty much it. This was a new invention called a VCR. It made it possible to see movies in the privacy of my own home. And this is me. I know. So it was the summer after graduation from college, and I was home in Chappaqua, New York, in my old room in my parents' house, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And while my friends from Yale were, scattered doing things like going to join the Peace Corps, working on Wall Street, I thought that I wanted to make a computer game. And what happened there? Okay. This was my development system. I got my first Apple II in 1979. I was in high school and upgraded from there to the Apple II Plus and the IIe. And having my own computer in my own room, which I could use whenever I wanted, really changed my life. Not only did I not have to go spend as many quarters in the video game arcade, but I could actually use this computer to make games myself, which was a lot of fun. And I started doing that in high school. I continued into college. And yes, that was the computer that I used in college to write papers. The Mac came in senior year. And so the Apple wasn't great for word processing. It only had capital letters, no lowercase. And you could only hold about 3 pages of text in memory at a time. So I used the Apple for the first 3 years, then the Mac came in, and I gratefully switched to that. But when it came to coding, to playing games and writing games, the Apple was definitely the number one system. And this was the competitive field that I was thinking of plunging into. You can see Flight Simulator, Hitchhiker's Guide are up there. And one of these games is mine. Karateka, I had... I'd programmed Karateka in college, sophomore and junior years, which caused me to get really bad grades. Finally, it had been published, and Rotoscope Software, the company that made my software programming dreams come true, was my first publisher, and I had actually gone out to California to Broderbund in the summer between junior and senior years to finish Karateka. That had been a great experience. It was really my first taste of adult life, and that was sort of the prototype for what I wanted to do again. Karateka was a number one bestseller. The royalties enabled me to pay off my student loans right out of college, which was really nice, and kind of gave me a little bit of freedom. Instead of having to go out and get a job, I could sort of take a little time to think of what I really wanted to do. And I thought this was a good opportunity to do another game. So I kept a journal when I was in college, starting freshman year, and I wrote down what I thought and reflections. And memory is a funny thing. There's kind of a tendency, thinking back, to sort of smooth things over and imagine that I was smarter in retrospect than I actually was at the time. But rereading these journals kind of forces me to confront what I was really thinking about what was happening. And my big worry at this time, as a recent college graduate, was that the Apple II would turn out to be another fad, kind of like Rubik's Cube. I'd actually spent the summer between high school and college writing a book about how to win Rubik's Cube. I saw these other Rubik's Cube books on the bestseller lists, and I thought, well, there's a way to make some fast money. I'll write my own Rubik's Cube book. It'll be a bestseller, and there we go. So I did this, I sent my Rubik's Cube book to publishers, and they all rejected it, informing me that, of course, the Rubik's Cube craze was over. Last summer had been the time to write such a book, but not anymore. And I thought the same thing could very easily happen with the Apple II. I figured with Karateka, for the first time in my life, my timing had been good. I'd been lucky. I'd gotten it out just in time. But I figured now, I might be coming a little bit late to the party if I tried to do another game. Well, the other thing that was kind of holding me back was I really had this dream of making movies someday, writing screenplays, like my idol, Chris Columbus, who had written Goonies and Gremlins. I thought, I kind of wanted his life. And I thought if I spend a year writing another computer game, that's just going to, delay me from finding out if I could make it as a screenwriter. But I took the plunge. I figured I just had to make a game fast before the computer games market disappeared. And these were some of my sources of inspiration. Lode Runner had been published by Broderbund Software a couple years before. It was a puzzle game. Anybody here? How many people here played it? Cool. So, it had 150 levels, and it came with a level editor that would enable you to make your own levels as well. And that kind of modular design, really excited me. Castles of Dr. Creep by Ed Hobbs, also a Broderbund game. That was another puzzle-solving game which had kind of a Rube Goldberg quality. You could step on a pressure plate that would open a door but activate another trap. So you really had to think about it. So these were really primary inspirations. Another one, of course, was my own game, Karateka, which had smooth, fluidly animated characters that, I know it doesn't look that fluid, does it? But at the time, we thought it was. And it also had a kind of cinematic presentation that, whereas the puzzle games were sort of abstract, this put you into a story, a very rudimentary story, but still, you had the feeling that you were kind of living an adventure, as well as trying to win the game. So my high concept idea, if you will, was Lode Runner plus Karateka, to kind of blend these two things together. And finally, I have to mention another source.
Give me the whip. Throw me the idol.
Could we turn up the volume?
No time to argue. Throw me the idol. I throw you the whip. Give me the whip. Adiós, señor.
Could anybody even see that screen? From where I'm standing, it looked black. No? Oh. But you've all seen the movie, right? Yeah. Yeah, this is actually a VHS capture, I believe, 1985 technology. Well, that was the opening sequence of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones runs, jumps, tries to jump over a pit, misses, grabs on with his fingertips, and then pulls himself up and rolls under the gate just as it's closing. So that sort of visceral excitement was what I wanted to get into my game that I was about to make. And whereas in Lode Runner and puzzle games like that, the character ran and jumped and did a lot of the same things that Indiana Jones was doing in the sequence, but it had this kind of floaty feeling. I wanted to do a game where if you missed, you could grab on and pull yourself up. If you fell too far, it would felt like it really hurt. So these things all sort of fed into what I wanted to do at the time. And by the way, the guide Satopo, who falls on the spikes in this sequence, which you just didn't see, is played by Alfred Molina, who would go on to be in the Prince of Persia movie 25 years later. I thought that was very cool. Okay, this one we can see. So the game needed a setting, and it was on a visit to Broderbund during a brainstorming session that Gene Portwood, an old a veteran Disney animator, suggested, what about Alibaba, Sinbad? And that really grabbed my imagination because, of course, the 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights as they're called, but they're really old Persian tales. I'd read the childhood versions of these stories as a kid, and I'd seen movies like Warner Brothers' Alibaba Bunny, comics like Howard the Duck, the Sinbad movies. It was sort of in all of our collective unconscious, but it hadn't been done yet in a computer game. And I thought, I went back, I reread the Arabian Nights, and it was just this deep well of characters and archetypes. And not only that, I thought it could actually translate to the Apple II computer screen, which is 280 by 192, because baggy pants and arches and columns, are something that you could actually represent clearly in 40 pixels. So this is how I started. The publisher had kind of been hoping that I would do Karateka 2, so they were a little disappointed when I told them I wanted to do an original IP. Some things never change. But so I got started, and to do the animation, because my own animation skills were pretty limited, I could draw okay, but when I tried to make the character move, it became clear that I was not a trained Disney animator. And on Karateka, I'd use a technique called rotoscoping, which goes back to silent film. This is basically the idea is to take a film and then take each frame and trace it or somehow cartoonize it and then make a sort of a flip book, which Muybridge did with a horse here. And Disney used this technique in Snow White, although they don't like to talk about it, for Prince Charming and Snow White. Ralph Bakshi had used it more recently in his Lord of the Rings animated film, and of course I'd used it in Karateka. So I like the idea of using silent movie techniques for a game, partly because games were a new medium and they didn't have dialogue. You couldn't move the camera a lot. They had a lot of the same limitations that silent film had in the early days. So I shot some reference footage. That's my brother David. He was 16 years old in high school at the time. This is actually filmed in the Reader's Digest parking lot across the street from our high school. So I had him run, jump, and he wasn't the greatest athlete, but he was willing to do it for free. And whereas Karateka, I'd used Super 8 film. For this, I used the new technology of videotape. And a VHS camera at the time was not really an everyday piece of household equipment. It cost $2,500, which was more than twice the cost of my entire development system. But I'd gotten my first credit card, Diners Club card, upon graduating from college. And I think one of my first purchases was this VHS camera, taking advantage of the 30-day back guarantee. I bought the camera, shot this footage, and then immediately mailed it back because I didn't want it in the house. I couldn't afford to own it. I felt a little guilty about it, but I was trying to keep costs down. So at this point, a year went by before I actually did anything with that footage. And the reason is because on the Apple II, we didn't have development environments. Even the tool that I used to draw shapes, to move pixels on the screen and kind of get things looking the way they should, that didn't exist. I had to code that myself, and as well as the tools to capture frames of animation and replay them and move them around the screen. So all that took time. And at the same time, I was negotiating with Broderbund to try to get a deal that would enable me to get out of my parents' house, where I was going stir crazy, and go back to California and work in their offices in an environment of other programmers and people that I could learn from. And this took a while because Karateka had been a big success, and they were really eager to hire me, to have me come out and work for them as a programmer. But I didn't want that. I wanted to stay independent and repeat the arrangement that we had on Karateka, which was basically like book publishing, where I would be equivalent to a book author. I would sort of make the game on my own time. They wouldn't pay me, but they would have the right to publish it when it was done. So it kind of took a while to reach agreement on this. And finally we did. And I was very happy. I was able to move 3,000 miles away to San Rafael, California. And I had, not only an office where I could go wherever I want with computers. I had other programmers in the office next door. It was a lot better than working in my room at home, I thought. And I also had my own car and rented an apartment. It was really my first time really living as an adult. And Prince of Persia was a title that my producer, Ed Badasov, came up with. At the time, I thought that this might make an okay tentative working title until we figured out what the real title was going to be. In the meantime, I was calling the game Thief of Baghdad. And of course, they still would have rather had Karateka 2. So a year after I shot this footage, I took it to the next step, which was, that looks dark from here. Can everybody see? Is there any way to brighten that? Maybe I can do it here. Let's see. You can see it? Okay, cool. So having shot that footage, the challenge was to get it into the computer, which of course is something we can do now by pressing a button on a cell phone. But with the technology I had, it was a bit more of a challenge. And I experimented with various techniques and finally came upon a way that worked pretty well. This involved buying a VCR. This time I bought it for real. It had to be a VCR that had a clean freeze frame. So I set up a 35 millimeter film camera on a tripod, drew the curtains to shut out the light from the room, and took a picture of the screen. Frame advanced the film, took another picture, frame advanced, took another picture, skipping every third frame so that it was 8 frames a second. So in this way, I exposed several rolls of film, took it down to the photomat, developed them, and then this gave me my flip book for the rotoscope. So here, what I did, I went with a black Sharpie and outlined the character, then used whiteout to sort of create a clean silhouette, which let me get to the next step of doing a black and white Xerox of that frame, which I then put on an animation stand, pointed a kind of a cheap black and white security type video camera at it, and there was a British company that made a card for the Apple II, which made it possible to digitize one frame of video. And so I captured this frame into the computer, and then I was able to use my own drawing tools to clean up the frames, cut them out, move them around. And this is what it looked like. That was a thrilling moment for me to, after 2 months of work, to see that character running and jumping on the screen. And this is what the character looked like after cleanup. So at this point, I had my kind of technical proof of concept. And I switched gears and really focused on game design. It's interesting, on every project I've worked on since, this always comes up, at the beginning. How do you start? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you start by making a game that's fun but ugly? Or do you start by trying to make something that looks like the game, that kind of gives you a vertical slice of gameplay, and then build out from there? So I won't pretend that there's one answer that works for every project, but for Prince of Persia, for what it's worth, I started like this, by getting a character running and jumping, and then I built the game out from that. And I built the world in a modular way. The idea being that I could build levels like LoadRunner in sort of a level editor, and so that I could quickly move around and recombine pieces to change the gameplay experience. Then I could play test and iterate very quickly. And this is what the game looked like 8 months in. I was sort of going along the idea that I would get the game features working one by one, starting with pressure plates and gates, linking pressure plates and gates together. And you can see it's very slow. I was going to have to re-optimize the graphics routines many times after this. But I was building up the game so that I could actually play it at every stage. Now, the tools that I was using were these sort of cursor-driven, pixel-moving tools, keystroke-driven tools that it was really easy to crash. You had to know what not to do. In short, they were tools that only I could use and that only a programmer could love. And at a certain point, for the level editor, I really wanted to go beyond that and make a tool that was more fully featured. And this is the level editor. It took a few months of upfront investment to build. If you see, I had a menu screen where you could actually pick up pieces with this 3D scrolling cursor and then drop them into the environment. I was inspired partly by the Mac interface, but if I'm being honest, really by a game called Pinball Construction Set, which was the first Apple II game to use that sort of graphical Mac-type interface in a game. And it was a lot friendlier than having to memorize 15 different keys that you had to use. And so that's the way I did it. And I was going to all this effort not just to make my own life easier, but because I had the idea that, like LoadRunner, I would include the level editor as a feature on the game disk so that people who bought the game could make their own levels. and then maybe we could have a contest for Prince of Persia levels and publish the best 50 levels as a championship Prince of Persia, that kind of thing. And for that, I had to make this level editor pretty bulletproof so that consumers, wouldn't accidentally create a level that would cause bugs. Now, I was coding, of course, but also at the same time, I was sort of switching hats between programming tools, programming the gameplay, and also thinking about what the gameplay should be, designing the story and the characters, as well as doing the art and animation. It was, my job title was programmer. All those other things were kind of extra. They weren't really recognized as, things that you might hire somebody to do separately from programming the game. And because of that, it went pretty slowly. I was doing these tasks sequentially. Obviously, a week that I spent working on a tool was a week in which the game didn't advance at all. And in the course of that, I filled a lot of these yellow pads with gameplay ideas. This is one gameplay idea that didn't make it. The moving wall. I thought it would be too difficult to actually implement. About this time, Broderbund received a submission of a game from a Russian programmer, Alexei Patnikov, called Tetris. And submissions are supposed to be highly confidential, but somehow this one leaked out, and Roland Gustafsson, who's kind of the unsung hero of Prince of Persia and Karateka, Roland reverse engineered Tetris in an afternoon on the Apple II. And so this sort of unofficial copy of Tetris circulated among everybody in the office. And so I and all the other programmers stopped working on what we were doing to play Tetris and try to beat each other high scores. It was a considerable distraction. In the end, Broderbund didn't publish Tetris because although we were all addicted to the game, the conclusion was that this was a game that only programmers would like. It was. Now, Roland did the disk routines and the copy protection for both Karateka and Prince of Persia. He knew more about the Apple II than anybody I'd ever met. And he really raised my game, in terms of pushing this computer to its limits. And my favorite entry out of all the journals I kept is one that I wrote on the morning when Roland had helped me upgrade from the assembler I was using to ProDOS and Merlin. And watching how he did it and the recompiling code that he'd just written, while I watched, just filled me with admiration for his hacker ethic. And so I wrote, quoting from my journal here, I wrote this at the world-weary age of 22. Roland is 23, but he is still young at heart. And where did the screen go? Okay. So the game was starting to take shape, and I realized that there were other movements that I hadn't filmed the first time around that I was going to need. For example, running and jumping, grabbing onto a ledge, you have momentum. So I needed to film the character swinging on the ledge as well and see how a swinging body came to a dead hang and then what it looks like when you drop from a dead hang. So I was able to take advantage of a visit from my brother, who is now a year and a half older and about 8 inches taller. But with the magic of my cartoonization process, I was able to correct for this and make all the footage fit. So we filmed this in the Broderbund parking lot. I had a conversation with my producer in February about when I was going to be finished with this game and concluded that I was going to be done in August, 6 months out. Little did I know that I was always going to be 6 months out from finishing, for at least the next 2 years. But until now, I've been making pretty slow but steady, consistent progress on the game. And it was about to hit a major setback. Okay, so the summer after college, that summer when I was at home videotaping my brother and negotiating with Broderbund and programming tools, I'd also written a screenplay because that was also one of my dreams. And some of my friends from college, like George Hickenlooper, had gone out to L.A. He was trying to make it as a screenwriter and film director, and that was really exciting to me. It seemed like a long shot. It didn't seem very realistic, whereas making computer games was. I don't know. But anyway, through one thing and another, I had the screenplay it was like a sort of a typical 80s movie. It was a thriller about a kid who's into cave exploring. And I'd given it to friends, and it eventually found its way into the hands of an agent in LA. And so now, against all odds, I got a call from a very nice lady named Virginia Garitlian, who is an agent at Leading Artists, saying, I've read your script, the head of the agency has read it, we love it, we want to represent you. Do you have any other movie ideas? Are you available for rewrite work? And how soon can you come down to LA? So I thought if I said tonight, it would seem overeager, so I said next Monday. And that was the beginning of my first Hollywood adventure. It was terrifically exciting. Within 10 days, I had not only an agent, but a producer, Larry Turman, who had produced The Graduate and John Carpenter's The Thing. Curtis Hanson wanted to direct it. It really seemed like we were going to make the movie. And so I kind of got distracted and didn't work on Prince of Persia for a while. Until I woke up one morning and realized that 8 months had gone by and we still hadn't made the movie. Pauline Kael once said that Hollywood is the only place where you can die of encouragement. And I figured that, I had this half-finished computer game waiting for me up in San Rafael. I really ought to finish it, and so I did. I went back to work. I still remember that feeling, that awful feeling of sitting down at this computer which had dust on it and booting up the source code and looking at it and being unable to remember what any of those instructions meant. I felt like I was looking at code that had been written by somebody else. But over a couple of days, I kind of, those mental gears got lubricated again, and I was back to advancing the game, putting in features, building up the gameplay step by step. This sketch interested me when I came across it because it reminded me that I didn't plan out what the Prince of Persia gameplay was going to be ahead of time. I just started building it up, and so there were some emergent properties that I hadn't imagined. For example, I had loose floors, I had pressure plates that could open gates, but what happened when a loose floor fell on a pressure plate? I had to deal with that. I figured, well, okay, it should just stick open that gate so it can never close again. Or vice versa, if it's the kind of pressure plate that closes a gate, it can protect you from that. So new puzzle ideas came out of that, and it's something that I wasn't smart enough to anticipate that before I'd actually created it. The game still had the ability to surprise me. The story of the game was still very much in flux. I mean, I had a vague idea of what it was, but it was a lot more complicated than what I finally ended up with. There was an amulet, there was a genie, it was, I forgot the details. Okay, so I'd been doing everything up to this point on 5 1/4-inch floppies, and I had a really cool development system because not only did it have 2 drives, but it had 2 computers. That is, one for playtesting and one for coding, so that I was able to take the disk out of one drive, put it into the other on the other computer, and then immediately play what I just coded. And if it crashed, it wouldn't crash my development system, and that saved me a lot of time. So I thought this was pretty much the last word in development environments. But when I got to Broderbund, some of the other programmers told me about this thing called a hard drive. I'd never seen one, but it sounded really cool. And it was really expensive. And so I persuaded the head of product development to requisition one for me. And he did. And a year later, it arrived. And it changed my life. I could work a lot faster. Instead of having to switch disks every time I was working on a different source code file, I could keep all my source code files in memory on the same disk. It was great. And the game, of course, was still limited by the memory of the Apple II itself, 64K, or about the size of an average email message with no attachments. And this had to contain not only the screen, actually 2 screens because I was page flipping, but also all the shapes of animation, all the sound effects, code, everything. And I was using every trick that I had to try to squeeze out a little extra shape for a few more frames of animation. And I was pretty much tapped out. Okay, so my best friend, Tommy Pierce, who was working in the office next door, creating educational software, whenever I had something cool up on the screen, I would show it to her, and she always said the same thing. She'd look at it, she'd say, combat, 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 and walk away, which drove me crazy. Because I explained to her the idea of this game. This was not a fighting game like Karateka. This was a puzzle game like Castles of Dr. Creep. And my basic concept was to create the most lifelike, fluidly animated human game character ever. And the trade-off of that was that there wasn't enough memory for two. There couldn't be another character. But that was okay because the idea was that this was a character who was trying to survive, like Buster Keaton, in a world that was dangerous, where he was escaping death through all these violent traps. But he himself was not a violent person. He was surviving. He wasn't dishing it out. Basically limbo. And which is a great game, by the way. And if I had seen that when I was trying to make this game, I would have been like, yes, that's what I want this game to be. But Tomi wouldn't settle for that. Every time she saw, what I had, she'd just say those same 3 words that drove me crazy. And she just wouldn't let it go. She'd say, well, why can't you use the same shapes for your enemy like you did in Karateka? And I explained, look, in Karateka it worked because I could swap out the head and just, make the other character look, identical but with this blue, evil, horned face. And so he looked like an enemy. But this character is too specific. He's got a personality that's expressed through his movements. He's cute. He's obviously the hero. I can't make the enemies look like that. And as I was explaining how the Apple II worked in a very patronizing, condescending way, I realized, wait a minute. What if I take each shape, each bite of the shape, shift it over 1 bit, exclusive OR it with itself, then the orange skin will turn white, the white body will turn black, and it'll have a sort of shimmering, ghostly outline around it. And I described this to Tomi, and her eyes lit up, and she said, Shadow Man. And that's how Shadow Man was born, out of 3 lines of code. It was my friend Robert Cook, who I was sharing an office with, who suggested the idea that Shadow Man could come into being by jumping through a mirror. And once he was in the game, everyone loved him, and it was as if, he'd always existed. I couldn't imagine the game without him. Yeah. Okay, so this game that was supposed to take me a year to make, which I'd started a year late, I was now 3 years out of college, and the Apple II market had begun its long downward spiral. I'd been living off Karateka royalties for the last 3 years, and as mentioned, I wasn't drawing a salary. I didn't have an income, and at this point, the stream of royalties had dwindled down to a trickle, and I had made an Excel spreadsheet showing me the number of months that I had left. And that kind of woke me up. Also, at this time, I got a new producer, Brian Ehler, had lobbied really hard to become the producer for this game, and he kind of lit a fire under me, really got me thinking in terms of, rather than just sort of perfecting and improving the game indefinitely, what would it take to finish it? And so we made a schedule, got me on a schedule, and I agreed that I could finish the game in 6 months. And this is what the game looked like. Looks pretty close to the finished version, right?
Yep.
So, about this time, I became aware of a problem. It was, the game was getting close, but it wasn't actually much fun to play. I would, when people played it, it was beautiful. It totally impressed them. But they would pick up the joystick, they'd play it for a while, they'd say, oh, cool, beautiful, awesome. And then they'd put down the joystick and walk away. And I knew this was not a good sign. It was, I'd made a game that, as Gene Port would like to call it, was an effect in search of a game. It just didn't have that, I got to keep playing quality. And Tomi, as usual, came up with a pithy phrase to express this, which I recorded bitterly in my journal. This is Tomi speaking. I like games where you can shoot things. Your game has no rewards except getting to the next level. It's all about survival and no triumph. And of course, she was right. So I had sort of a crisis where for about a week I just re-examined all my assumptions about what I thought this game was going to be. And I went back and I looked at my first game, Karateka, which I'd sort of been dismissing as a very different kind of game, a simple, mindless, repetitive kind of gameplay, whereas Prince of Persia was going to be a more sophisticated, like a Lode Runner, Dr. Creep type game that really engaged your intellect, as well as your fingers on the buttons. And but I realized that Karateka, for all its simplicity, had some basic virtues that I'd been overlooking. I've speeded this up 4 times the original speed, so it doesn't take too long. Karateka, you're always moving left to right. You knew what your goal was. It was, moving right equaled progress. Every fight had these strength meters so that you could tell at a glance whether you were winning or losing. And your goal, not only the girl who was waiting at the end of the game, but along the way, every fight, every signpost, every gate told you were getting closer to your goal. And, whoops. All these things that Prince of Persia lacks, Karateka had in spades. So I think, how can I get that kind of emotional feeling into it? And here's another quote from my journal. I wrote, "How can I be so up on screenplay story structure and so blind when it comes to my own game? A story doesn't move forward until a character wants something. A game doesn't move forward until the player wants something. Every event should move you closer or further away from your own from your goal, or it's not really a goal, it's just window dressing." So I had to tell my producer that we were actually further from our goal of alpha than we had been the week before. Why? Because I had thought about it over the weekend and decided that the game wasn't fun. That wasn't a fun conversation. But they weren't paying me, so they couldn't fire me. So I set about reducing the scope of the game from 50 levels, which was sort of my Lode Runner conception of it. That was all about puzzles, to sort of a simpler Karateka type game, where it was going to be just 10 easy levels. You start in the dungeon, you work your way up to the palace, and end with the princess. Simple story. And with this, I also dumped the level editor that I'd lavished so many months on creating and making user-friendly. And this is my first pass of what eventually became the first level of the game. Luckily, because I had that level editor, it made it pretty easy for me to ditch everything I had and rebuild new levels, because these pieces were so easy to move around. But my next step, I realized, had to be to implement sword fighting, because without it, it was just too difficult to imagine in the abstract what the game was actually going to feel like to play. Yeah, that's me again. So I'd shot this reference footage a few months earlier. Using all the knowledge that I'd gained in my 1 semester of mandatory high school fencing. But I felt it lacked something, a certain excitement, a certain je ne sais quoi. So as I was trying to figure out how to make sword fighting more exciting, I turned, of course, once again to my favorite childhood movies. A little dark again, huh? All right, so I watched this sequence, and there was a 6-second sequence where there's no cuts, and it's just Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone fighting in profile. So I really analyzed that sequence, trying to see what it was that gave it that sort of back and forth, up and down Hollywood sword fight feeling. I did my photomat thing, got my flip book, and spread out those 36 frames on the floor of my office, and really broke it down, trying to figure out what they were doing in every frame. And out of that, I kind of came up with a tentative system to put that into the gameplay. I've been thinking that I was going to rent a camera and get some people to act out those moves, but I realized that actually everything that I needed was contained already in those 6 seconds of Robin Hood. With blithe disregard for copyright law, I I took those frames, I gave it the Sharpie whiteout treatment, and in a few days I had it up and running in the game. And that was a thrill as big as when I'd gotten the character up and running for the first time. It totally changed the game. Those are the 6 seconds. Those are the key frames out of which I got everything I needed. Up, down. And that's how it appeared in the game. That's the final fight with Jafar. So, of course, yet again, Tomy was right. And my New Year's resolution for 1989 was simply to finish the game. So, designing those levels, I went back and I played my favorite platform games again, trying to figure out what it was that made games fun and addictive, trying to get the right balance of action, exploration, puzzles, and the level editor, of course, made it so easy to remake the levels and change them. This is the office where I've been living for the last 3 years. Yes, that is a mullet. And they say programmers have no sense of style. I'm going to read something I wrote in my journal about this time because I think it really captures that particular moment. The game is definitely entering a new phase. The serene, solitary part of it is ending, and other people are getting into the act. My job now is not just trying to make a fun game, but getting people excited about it, and to a degree orchestrating their efforts without stepping on their toes. The world has left me alone for 2.5 years, and now it's bursting in. I'm not ready. There's so much work still to do. That's a feeling I can still identify with, and I think any book author knows how it feels to let go of the thing that's been yours and let other people start doing their thing. This is a sketch that I did for the package art, which all the stuff, marketing discussions, talking about conversions and so forth, was really important, and I really wanted to be involved in it, but at the same time it was taking my time away from what I needed to be doing, which was finishing the game. Again, just to kind of place us in the historical timeline. This is a finished level from the game. You can see this is sort of how that first level of Raiders of the Lost Ark that had inspired the game in the first place kind of found its way into specific moments within the levels. Remember the moment when Indiana Jones is fighting the soldier on the propeller of the plane and backs him into the... Yeah, that was my version of that. About this time, a friend brought his sons, who were 5 and 7 years old, into the office. And for half an hour, I got to just sit and watch them play the game. And that was really a great moment because I didn't say anything. I just watched them play. I watched them die on the spikes over and over for half an hour. But they kept coming back. They kept trying it again and again. And I realized that the game was, first of all, the game was working, which was very rewarding to see. But most importantly, I liked these kids. And I saw that they loved games. And the fact that I had made a game that they thought was cool and they were willing to play it kind of reminded me of why I had begun this in the first place. And it really made the whole thing worthwhile. This was as I was building the final levels, I was trying to think of ways to create special moments in the game that people would remember, so it wasn't all the same thing over and over. But there was no time to create new assets. And of course, a lot of the great ideas that I'd had, like the skeleton coming to life, the little white mouse, a lot of these had to go by the boards because there was just no time to do them. So many of those moments that we remember from the game sort of got crammed in there in those last few weeks. Again, just to put these struggles into perspective. The Iron Curtain was coming down. I went to New York for a week to work with my dad. He'd offered to compose the music for the game within the limitations of the Apple II speaker, which couldn't really play two notes at the same time. So he'd play the music on his Steinway, and I'd walk over to the computer and I'd type in the hexadecimal note values to try to simulate what he'd done. It was pretty agonizing, but even that crude music added a lot to the game. This is the opening sequence. This is the penultimate battle here with before you go fight Jafar. And again, how do you create a boss fight when you've got no time or memory to put in new animations? This is the battle with your shadow self. And the trick here was that every time you hit him, you lost a point of your strength because, of course, he's your reflection. He is you. So the only way you could win this fight is to go against every reflex that you've learned in the course of the game, put down your sword and rejoin with him, and then you get back all the hit points that you'd lost along the way. And most importantly, I was able to do this in a day. As a last reshoot, that's Brian Ehler, producer, and that's Peter Rideau's daughter, Tina, in her prom dress in the glamorous attic office. And yeah, Brian enjoyed that day. And that's the game. And I see we're actually out of time. Do people need to go? I could talk for 5 more minutes. Okay. If anybody needs to leave, I totally understand. And thank you for coming. Okay, so we're at Goldmaster. I'd fixed all the last bugs, and I would like to say that the game went on to become a big hit, and the rest is history. But once again, I have these old journals which remind me of what really happened. As I might have mentioned, the Apple II market was dying, and this Christmas '89, it was still possible for certain games like Vertebran's top seller, Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego, could still sell 15,000 copies in 1 month. But stores at this point were kind of closing down their Apple sections. They were not interested in taking on new Apple titles. And so I had that Christmas, I sort of endured the agony of seeing that Karateka, which was a 5-year-old game, was outselling Prince of Persia. Just simply because stores didn't have it. Nobody would carry it. It was getting great reviews, but nobody knew about it. So I pinned all my hopes on the PC and Amiga conversions, which this is the PC version. As you can see, it was greatly enhanced with color, better sound, using the MIDI sound card. And my dad went back and reorchestrated the music to take advantage of what this machine could do. Real artists came in and redid the graphics to make them more beautiful. And the PC was the top platform. It was on its way to world domination. And so I really pinned my hopes on the Prince of Persia becoming a hit in its PC version. Released in May 1990, and it didn't sell. There were a lot of reasons for that. One was that it was a conversion, not an original title. Stores didn't really want to carry conversions of a title that hadn't sold well in the first place. And also, it was a flip-top box, which was seen as very old-fashioned. At this time, all the top-selling games came in bigger candy boxes, and that's what stores wanted to carry. So, in September, I got the chilling news that the largest chain electronics boutique had recalled and delisted the game in all formats. So, this was a year after the first release. Prince of Persia had sold 10,000 copies in all formats, and it looks like that was going to be it. So I kind of figured, okay, this is long story short, we were saved by a combination of factors. The Mac version had been delayed by the programmer who was doing it was very methodical, and he had remade the game every time a new Mac came out, so that, first for the LC, for color graphics, and then for the large screen, so that by the time it finally came out 2 years late, there was a Mac market ready and waiting for this game. There was a new marketing department. They re-released the game in a new candy box, and suddenly, years after its release, Prince of Persia was selling. And most importantly, the foreign and console versions, which had been done by teams I'd never met in countries where I'd never been, were now released. And Prince of Persia went on to sell on all platforms worldwide 2 million copies. Anyway, we're out of time. If you want to hear more details about... thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind.
Oh, well,